The story of the selection of the Tokarev design over the modified Semenov submission is one of political favoritism tinged with bureaucratic inertia. The Red Army Artillery Directorate's trials of 1938 intended to choose a new self-loading rifle and began on 20th of November 1938. Soon the judges noticed weaknesses in the firing pin and extractor of the Semenov design. In spite of this, the Commission also looked at the comparative ease and cost of manufacture for the two designs. The Semenov rifle was much lighter than the Tokarev design, which would later become the SVT-38 and somewhat later still the SVT-40 by almost 4 pounds. The Tokarev would also cost more to produce. The Semenov was found to be superior to the Tokarev in other areas as well, for the number of parts, ease of production, as well as savings on metal in making parts. Still, on July 17, 1939, during a cabinet meeting, the decision was made to concentrate on producing the Tokarev design as the SVT-38, and Joseph Stalin is noted as having urged the cabinet to take the decision they did. A participant of the meeting, former Deputy People's Commissar of Armament Vladimir Novikov, recalled the decision-making process of that period and indicated that personal relationships, seniority, and some design elements of the Semenov design were critical to its failure to be accepted. In quote, "We hesitated when we had to decide which rifle was to be preferred, the one designed by Tokarev or the one designed by Semenov. The Tokarev rifle was heavier, but had shown its durability. It had suffered far fewer breakages. The slim and light rifle presented by Semenov, though superior to the Tokarev model in many other respects, was inferior in a major one. The firing pin fractured inside the bolt. Caused by nothing other than the inadequate material of which the firing pin was made, that failure determined the results. Not without importance was the fact that Tokarev was well liked by Stalin, who knew nothing about Semenov. Another perceived flaw of the Semenov rifle was its short bayonet, which resembled a heavy knife. At that time, some people insisted that in hand-to-hand combat, the old, long, multi-edged bayonet was much more useful." Unquote. Despite losing to Tokarev, in his bid to have his design accepted as the new standard-issue semi-automatic and selective-fire infantry rifle, all was not over for Semenov and his future fortunes. The successful and accepted SVT-40 and AVT-40 designs, while hard-hitting, reasonably accurate, at least in semi-automatic fire, and robust, had their own fair share of failures in the field. Many Soviet frontoviki, or conscripts, found the Tokarev rifle's adjustable gas system hard to master, seeing as it involved tuning the gas system to handle lots of ammunition of varying quality, as were produced in the Soviet Union during hostilities. Certain recruits also had a hard time learning to successfully clean their rifles' gas systems, including the gas system piston, tappet rod, spring, spring guide, and piston bushing, while others, who were veterans of the pre-war Red Army, found the jump from the relatively Spartan bolt-action Mosin-Nagant to the comparatively more sophisticated Tokarev system a hard one to make. The Germans, for their part, copied the Tokarev gas system in their own G43 rifle, and in so doing fielded a weapon that some Soviet soldiers preferred to their own SVT-40s and AVT-40s when they could find them by either battlefield pickup or capture. On the other side, however, the Germans were keen to pick up captured or abandoned examples of Tokarev rifles, as the final iteration of the G43 was not successfully in the pipeline until the 1943 to 1944 period, so early German soldiers in the USSR were quite happy to use the Tokarev, as they were initially without a semi-automatic weapon of their own. The SVT-38 and SVT-40 were eventually given the German designations of Self-Loading Rifle 258R and Self-Loading Rifle 259R respectively. These designations are, of course, in English translation. An additional 15,000 SVT-40s were captured and used by the Finnish military forces during the continuation war between the USSR and Finland and Germany from 1941 to 1944. In 1941, Semenov competed with longtime Soviet designer Vasily Degtyaryov over a new anti-tank rifle needed to stem the hordes of German panzers that now threatened the Soviet heartland. Semenov's new anti-tank rifle, designated the Protivo-tankovoe Ruzhye Semenova, Model 41, or Semenov anti-tank rifle model of 1941, used a tilting bolt that completely did away with the sliding receiver locking wedge of earlier designs and was functionally almost identical to the bolt system of the Tokarev rifles. The firearm was gas-operated, using propellant gases tapped more conventionally from a hole in the barrel rather than from a cupped muzzle-end gas trap as on the AVS-36 rifle. The bolt block consisted of a bolt carrier that hooked into the bolt underneath, which held a firing pin that was actuated by a hammer attached to the trigger mechanism below. A recoil spring with rigid spring guide led to the rear of the bolt and recoil assembly, and a round outer cover provided a buffer for the recoil spring to slam into during rearward travel of the bolt carrier and spring. The rear receiver cover could be removed with the removal of a through pin on the right side, although the pin was not captive and could be lost under the stress, duress, and confusion of combat if the action needed to be opened to be cleaned or to clear stoppages during the height of fighting. The PTRS-41 served alongside Degtyaryov's PTRD-40, itself a fairly close copy of the World War I era Imperial German T-Gewehr. Both arms fired the 14.5 by 114 mm anti-tank cartridge. Semenov's anti-tank rifle was more comfortable to shoot than the PTRD-40, as the former, with its adjustable gas system, allowed for the venting of excessive propellant gas, which somewhat reduced felt recoil. Interestingly, the PTRS-41 utilized an integral 5-round box magazine that could have its body dropped away from the rest of the rifle, but was hinged at its front part so as not to be lost. 5-round en-bloc clips of anti-tank ammunition were loaded from the bottom, as on a French RSC M1917 rifle. The same year as his triumph with the PTRS-41, Semenov embarked on the creation of a refined selective-fire, self-loading rifle chambered for the standard 7.62 by 54 mm cartridge. The design was essentially a scaled-down PTRS-41 and retained the top barrel gas piston with the gas block diverting vertically 90 degrees away from the barrel, the internal hinge box magazine, and the simplified hammer-fired tilting bolt locking arrangement. The design was submitted for review in April 1941, but the exigencies of World War II dictated that the original schedule for the production of 50 trials pieces, which were originally promised to occur by April 1942, had to wait all the way until May of 1944. The two trials designs from 1941 submitted were known as the SKS-30 and SKS-31, with SKS, an abbreviation of Samozariadnaya Karabina Semenova, or Semenov Semi-Automatic Carbine, and the two-digit number, an indication of the number of revisions or modifications to the design since Semenov's last effort in 1939. Both trials rifles were chambered in the 7.62 by 54R mm cartridge and were, at 43 inches, roughly 5 inches shorter than the SVT-40 and somewhat lighter. The SKS-30 was loaded from the bottom of the magazine using a 5-round en-bloc clip, and the SKS-31 was loaded from the top with 5-round charges, or with individual rounds. By summer 1944, big changes were afoot. The SVT-40 had been a good companion of the Red Army soldier on the battlefield despite its problems, but was now overshadowed by the PPC-SH-41 and PPS-43 submachine guns. Continued reliability issues with the SVT-40 eventually led to the reinstatement of M9130 Mosin-Nagant production and the end of SVT-40 production at Tula, the one arsenal producing it by this late in the war, in February 1945. In 1941 and 1942, the dispersed factory number 314 of the Tula arsenal, located in Mednogorsk, had been charged with building 50 SKS-30 and SKS-31 prototypes, but had been then overly occupied with producing SVT-40s. By 1944, however, the factory had time to produce the new Semenov gun, and after their completion, both controlled trials at the officers' training school, known as Vystrel, and field trials began. The Vystrel trials went well, with one of the prototypes firing 8,000 rounds and experiencing malfunctions in only 1.76% of the shots fired. The field trials, on the other hand, were more mixed. 37 of the 50 prototypes produced by Factory 314 at Mednogorsk were issued to one company of the 1080 Infantry Regiment of the 1st Belarusian Front in the fall of 1944. The troops issued the rifles found them handier than the SVT-40, but had issues with jamming, including rim lock, from the stacking of the rimmed 7.62x54R cartridges in the magazine. The muzzle compensator reduced muzzle climb and recoil, but made the guns report extremely loud. It is important to note that these SKS-30 and SKS-31 field trials rifles, though used on an active battlefront, did not actually fire shots in anger before the end of hostilities, and therefore the oft-repeated gun show conventional wisdom most often heard among North American SKS collectors and shooters about the SKS seeing combat use in the waning days of World War II is actually untrue. With the Tokarev undergoing a rapid fade-out from Soviet frontline use, and the war now over in Europe in May 1945, Soviet military leadership looked to a new small arms plan. The new push revolved around a new cartridge. In 1943, some years after the first Soviet 4.5mm intermediate cartridge, that is to say a cartridge with a velocity between that of a full-length rifle caliber, such as 7.62x54R, and a pistol cartridge, had been abandoned, new efforts were made. In a move startlingly similar to German efforts in producing their own intermediate cartridge, the 7.92x33mm Kurz, basically just a shortened 7.92x57mm Mauser rifle round, as used in the MP-44 Sturmgewehr. The Soviets too retained the .311 caliber of their 7.62x54mm R bullet, but reduced the case length to 39mm and dispensed, finally, with the antiquated rim. Initial offerings were of a 7.62x41mm round, and some of this ammunition was further used by Semenov prototypes into the 1945 and 1946 period before the 7.62x39 M43 round was standardized for frontline usage, and the 7.62x54R round retained only in Soviet general-purpose machine guns, aircraft guns, and for the use of snipers.